Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Jason Rowntree from Michigan State University, who is working on systems to increase the resilience and reduce the environmental harm of our food systems. Finding the drivers across rural America that encourage management practice to improve soils and protect local environments and climate are a key priority of his work. Jason has built and runs the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at Michigan State, where he is increasingly seeing the benefits for farmers that adopt regenerative practices to improve soil health through no-till, cover crops, biodiversity, and the incorporation of grazing animals into cropping systems. Adding resilience to the farms and ranches of Michigan and further across the country is a key focus of his work. Jason, thank you very much for joining me today.
Great to be on and looking forward to it, man.
So you're working on sustainable agriculture, very much in the livestock sector. So can you just start with your journey in terms of how you got to where you're at and the work you've been doing over your career?
Yeah, so my dad's a cosmetic dentist. But my sister and I, when we were young, we would go to our local fair and we both fell in love with that. And so we started showing livestock at a fairly young age. And so I kind of came through the show ring in Texas, grew up north of Houston, went to A&M. And so we showed sheep and cattle and hogs all growing up. And I really became I loved livestock evaluation. I loved the art and the science of it. And so I, through college, I participated in livestock judging and then coached livestock judging teams. And worked through that, and this was in the 90s. And so I came to Michigan State in the 90s, and I coached a judging team and did a PhD here. And so that was kind of how I entered. And then the closest job to Texas was at Louisiana State, and this had probably been in 2003. And so my wife and I and our young son, we packed it and headed to Baton Rouge, and I did nutrition work on my PhD, trace mineral nutrition. And so I got down to Louisiana, and instead of having an Angus and Hereford cows like we had in Michigan, we had Brangus and Brayford cows. And so I started doing, regular supplemental nutrition, right? Like soy hull pellets. And, we got a lot of really low quality hay in the South there. And so, looking at protein supplementation and pretty simple stuff. And so, things were rolling along. I wasn't doing anything real cool. And then Hurricanes Katrina and Rita hit in 2005. And we were, not far from New Orleans, obviously. And I was actually south of New Orleans within a week of the storm. And, in the state of Louisiana law, it says that extension employees are considered first responders for a food disaster. And well, if there's ever a food disaster, it was those two hurricanes. And so we had cows running all over the place, south of New Orleans, crazy stuff. And, I just started thinking about it, looking at all the devastation. I just started kind of, looking at, man, what happens here, right? We don't have a lot of real food around. We got a lot of good commodity ag, but not a lot of local or regional food. And we got a lot of fossil fuel in our systems. And so I just started thinking about that. And it kind of struck me, and I kind of put it in the back of my head. And then about, 4 years later, I had the opportunity to come back to Michigan State. My mentor, Dr. David Hawkins, had retired, and there was a position open. And so I was able to come up here, and I've been here for 16 plus years. And part of the deal was that we have a center, Lake City Research Center, which is about 500-600 grazable acres up in North Michigan. And Dr. Harlan Ritchie was, that's where he brought some of the very first continental cattle in the 70s into the United States, into that farm. We brought Fleckvieh cattle out of Austria and other countries. And so it's got a lot of history, and Harlan Ritchie's a god in the beef cattle industry. And so I came to the farm and basically had this blank canvas of trying to think about what this looks like. And we didn't call it sustainability. We didn't call it regenerative. At that time, Kit Farrow, which is this really renegade rancher in Colorado, right? He was using the term, low input ranching, I think. And so that's kind of what I was thinking about. And so I started there and have been doing the work ever since.
Wow, that's a great story, and the fact that Hurricane Katrina and those other hurricanes they impacted you, and you actually, I can relate back to my time working in the developing world where you see the impacts of some of these climate related incidents and disasters on people, their livelihoods, their homes, and stuff like that, and it certainly has a very, very deep and lasting impression, and can be very motivational.
Absolutely. I saw things I never care to see again. Crazy, we found cows. I've told the story probably 100 times, but you know, uh, we we found cows that had brands on ranches that started the storm on the east side of the Mississippi, and we found them on the west side of the Mississippi. So if you think about how big and bold the Mississippi River is as it enters into the Gulf of Mexico, those cows are tough, and they made it all the way across the river, and I saw we were at a spot that had 25 to 27 foot of storm surge, and I mean think about that, like it's crazy, and I saw tricycles in the tops of trees, and just crazy stuff, and it does impact. I grew up with storms, and I grew up around the Houston area and get it, but it does, and I've worked a lot, and not a lot, but I've worked in 3 different countries in Africa, and kind of seen the impact of that as well, and it just kind of just humbles you. And we talk about all this stuff with climate and metrics and what to measure, and it really gets you back into thinking about resilience and food security, and just kind of simplifying the equation a bit.
So back onto the resilience and food security, and there's the one of the great things about our farming systems, our food systems, is their diversity. You've got everything from down in the southeast it's subtropical up to the temperate conditions, where you are up in Michigan, and then obviously when you start looking at Europe, when you start looking at Australia, when you start looking at South America and Africa and India, you've just got such a huge plethora of different systems, which is great. And it makes it so colorful and brings characters into the industry and all that sort of stuff. But it also means there's certainly not one size fits all solutions would work across all those different geographies and cultures. So, how do you think about approaching sustainability and the resilience and food security given all that diversity as both an opportunity but also a challenge, I guess?
That's great. I think each farm has its own singular DNA. I mean, each farm is unique and different. My friend Russ Concert says each farm has its own fingerprint, and so I think step one is that we realize that, right? We can't broad stroke things like we want to do. Number one. Number two, I think no matter where you are and where you live, and I go back to a lot of things I've learned from Alan Savory over the last 20 years, and the fact that ecosystem processes will always need to be functioning no matter where you are or what you're doing. We always need our energy cycle. We need to be capturing solar energy. We need to be photosynthesizing, putting our solar dollars in the ground. We need a functioning water cycle. We have to have a functioning mineral cycle, and we need community dynamics. We need biology. We need large and small biodiversity. And no matter what we do, we have to have those 4 things to live. How those ecosystem processes are affected within the respect of that singular DNA of a farm is going to be different. Space and time confounding is huge. And so it's a function then of understanding what potential ecosystem processes may or may not be impaired, and how does management free up that logjam to improve overall productivity and resilience. And so that's kind of how the way that I think about it, and in the Midwest, we may not have as great of a water cycle issue. We have water quality issues, but we may not harvest solar energy as well as we can in the lower Great Plains, for example, right? And so all those things kind of factor in into to making better decisions that lead to improved productivity and stability, I think, in these systems.
So I'm sitting here in the Northern California on the west coast of North America, and the forests that basically run up and down the west coast, the redwood forests, sequoias, my understanding is that over 50% of the nutrients that have grown those forests originally came from the ocean. And then salmon is probably one of the primary vectors, but other vectors have harvested nutrients, nitrogen, other nutrients from the ocean, carried them up the streams. Then bears, eagles, coyotes, etc., insects, small mammals, reptiles have then taken those nutrients out of the river systems and spread them across the lands, and that's led to these amazing redwood forests, the biggest trees, biggest organism, I guess, on the planet, and that's all because animals are these nutrient transport systems. And if you start looking at the bison in the Great Plains, or if you look at the herds in across Africa, the wildebeest and antelope, etc., elephants, giraffe, along with the lions and the predators that make them move around, you've got the fact that these similar concepts where animals manage part of managing the natural vegetation, but they also transport nutrients. And my kind of
Right.
concept of regenerative agriculture is how do we actively manage? Because obviously rangelands or that wilderness is passively managed. We don't manage it; it's nature's forces. But in our food production systems, how do we kind of understand those concepts and then tweak them to manage it so we've got those nutrients, we've got the healthy soils, we don't have too much or too little vegetation cover. So how do you see all that and I guess where do you see the opportunities to actually help those land managers to actively manage the land in a similar way?
Yeah, and it's a great analogy that you're using, Ashley. I mean, it's and even if you think with the fish, there's also massive insect flora that are also driving those systems as well. I'm a river bum. I'm a trout bum, right? So I sit there and study river ecology and just I love it, right? And so I still think that we should apply these ideas and concepts of trophic cascades into into our farming systems, into how we produce food as well, and realizing that humans are amongst these systems. We're not above it either, right? Regardless, like there's always a human that has evolved cohabitating with the beautiful system you described with the salmon and so to me then it's really about capturing that biodiversity and understanding that resilience piece, right? And thinking that I know this, right? I'm this is anecdotal. I don't have my p-value, but if I'm putting out a cover crop or if I'm reseeding something and I put out 10 species in a field mixed together versus one or two, odds are that one of those 10 species will want to germinate in an area that I planted it into. But if I only take one or two, there's a much less odds that something will germinate because perhaps those conditions aren't right. And so the greater the biodiversity in that system, then the more resilience it has, the more opportunities for productive growth and stability that we do have. And I think that it's similar, right? So it's thinking in terms of nature, but applying it to how we produce food. And in that sheer chase for greater productivity and yield and efficiencies without tying that number to a natural resource has kind of led us down this very high productivity angle that has led to more monocultures in these systems, but it's really not anchored to anything in terms of resilience or regeneration, right? We don't look at a bushel of corn per acre per unit water conserved. We don't look at a bushel of corn per acre per amount of carbon absorbed. We just look at that bushel per acre, and that's how we pay. And therefore, there's been no real incentive to think even deeper or further into how we price this out in our North American agriculture system.
I couldn't agree with you more on that whole concept of how we're measuring things and whether the bushel of corn just seen as a bushel of corn and not all the, I guess, in so many ways, the you could call it ecosystem services that would come along with that or resource utilization services that come along with that. In many ways, I see this as being driven by what's easiest to measure. It's very easy to measure a bushel of corn or a ton of corn or a gallon of milk. It's much harder to measure all those other things. So, where do you see opportunities to evolve that way of thinking?
Great. Yeah, I do see a lot. I mean, first of all, I think anybody in this space is well intentioned. So if I come across critical, it's not a personal thing. It's just a function of where we are. And I do believe that regardless of an opinion on climate or regardless of the opinion of a greenhouse gas, we still need to understand the metrics of resilience and the metrics of energy efficiency tied to a natural resource because they're finite. And therefore, there are ways that we can do that. Now, we have to meet multiple goals when we assess these things. Number one, we've got to inform a farmer or a manager of how their decisions are impacting an ecosystem, an ecological function, right? Water, energy, the things we talked about, biodiversity, minerals. So we might need some leading indicators that explain to a farmer how their decisions in a short-term window influence their corn crop or influence their pasture recovery, right? And these are leading indicators. They're often more qualitative. They're very specific to that space. They often can be confounded more in time and space based on prior decisions. We can step it up a notch and say, you know what, we're going to measure the heck out of this smaller spot, and we're going to put water sensors, and we're going to take a lot of robust carbon measurements for below ground, and we're going to put flex towers, and we're going to use remote sensing. And these are the things I do a lot in my daily walk, and get really good metrics at that one farm. But then the scalability of those metrics, how does that look across a watershed? And so then, and so we have better information at a farm level, and can do that. So that's kind of that second approach. And that third approach is going to be, what does it look like for Tyson that might have 18 million acres in their supply chain? Well, at that point, we need to scale this up to more process-based modeling that can be perhaps very accurate across a large scope. We can run that in iterations over time, and reduce uncertainty by iterating a model, not just in year one, but year 1 to 30. And what does that mean look like over time based on the inputs we have for that said model, and can come up with a different answer to inform a different population, right? And somewhere in between, we've got more mechanistic modeling, right? That is there, that can be very useful, but often is more difficult to scale and requires greater calibration and greater input, right? So there's all these tools in the toolbox. Normally, what I say is we want to be ground up, top down, and meet farmers, ranchers, and supply chains in the middle, and use every tool we can in that toolbox to create the best assessment of metrics, and move forward, and kind of in that lens. And perhaps we can get to a point where we never dig another soil core as long as we live, or never use another soil sensor as long as we live. But it may not happen in my lifetime.
It's very interesting what you're saying because there is such diversity out there as we've discussed, but also, know, the resolution that you're monitoring everything on your research farm is awesome. But as you said, it's not scalable. You can't manage that level of or do that much measurement on the millions and millions of acres that are used to grow our food. And I guess one thing that I've been thinking about is we tend to like averages because they simplify the measurements. That cornfield had X number of bushels per acre, or et cetera, et cetera. That those cattle weighed X when they were weaned. But you lose the fact that there's lots of variation. Some parts of that cornfield may have been yielding 4, 5, 6, 7 times higher than some other parts of that cornfield. And is a way of changing the way we think about this, saying, let's look at that variation and see that as the opportunity, by
Mm.
identifying the most productive areas and what we're doing there, rather than just trying to simplify things by just averaging across those production systems.
Yeah. I call it ecological epidemiology, and it's kind of like how we maneuvered nutritional epidemiology into a, a BMI, and we judge people's health based on a BMI, which is nothing more than their height and weight, and we know nothing about their background or their health or their percent fat or whatever, right? And we do the same things in ag, and to me the beauty of the complexity and the opportunity, like you said, I agree, is in that opportunity of variation, right? Where if you my colleague Bruno Basso is global leader in modeling. He and I, along with the gentleman by the name of Ian Olson, was formerly McDonald's, we co-direct our Center for Regenerative Agriculture here at Michigan State. And Bruno is a leader in using digital twins. He's developed digital twins based on yield stability mapping in crop systems, and he can show a farmer that by looking at yield stability and creating a digital twin, that normally 30% of the nitrogen fertilizer they're putting out on a given field is being wasted because the soil and the yield stability and the soil mapping in those areas are very low. It needs to be in a buffer. It needs to be in a perennial. It needs to be trees, but yet we treat that acre, that nitrogen is either going into the water or up in the air, the same as we do another acre that might grow 300 bushel corn. And that nuance is the future. That understanding of precision is the future, and looking at these opportunities. I don't know if a farmer can be paid for avoidance in the future, or other opportunities. At least they're saving money by not pissing away that 30% of nitrogen on the field, right? But the point then is that we see the same variation in cattle, and I can look at the very top 5 to 10% of my cow herd. I can look at their methane numbers on a grazing season. I can look at their weaning weights. I can adjust it to a body condition score, and I can see that level of variation in a cow herd as well. And so the beauty in that is there is tremendous opportunity to refine our approaches, to nuance what we do in terms of whether it be a precision fertilizer or genetic selection or the management of a cow herd from ranch to ranch, and all meet these solutions while not having to reach into our pocket to purchase another technology, right? Or all these other things that are out there. I'm all for technology, don't get me wrong, but there's so much low-hanging fruit in that variation from acre to acre. There's from cow to cow, from manager to manager. There's a world of work we can do right there to last another few decades.
So digging into that a bit more, be that the nitrogen in the for the corn or the methane for the cattle, you've there's going to be a mix of some sort of monitoring, some sort of technology that comes as a as a guidance to models. Because as we've said before, we're not going to be able to
Right.
measure every single square foot of pasture or cornfield and soil or every single cow because it's just too expensive and it's just not possible. So I guess how do you see that nexus between what we need to actually measure to inform those decisions, and I guess also a bit about what that technology or what those solutions need to look like from a a farmer slash rancher perspective? Because if it's going to take an extra half a dozen staff and an extra couple of hours each day or extra few $100,000 to do, it's not going to. It needs to be simple. It needs to be easy. It needs to be cost effective. So where do you see that nexus between what we need to help guide those decisions and capitalizing on those opportunities
Yeah.
and that variability?
Yeah. Silver bullet question, right?
Well, there are no silver
And
bullets, so that's I'm not
well,
I'm not
no, no,
trying to
no.
get that
It's
out.
hard. It is hard. You're right, bro. But it is hard. Is what you're leading into that. It's not an easy thing to do. Um, our um Occam's razor. Occam's razor would suggest that the most simple approach is the best. Um, and therefore, I think that right now we're a part of a national project that I co-lead. That's we're working. It's 19 million through Foundation for Future of Ag Research, Noble Research, and others. Green Acres, Jones Family, Butcher Box. It's like I got my patches on my shirt for my sponsors here, like NASCAR. But the um, the fact is, we are doing tremendous in-depth measuring that can't scale, but I believe what we can learn, whether it might be we have a eddy covariant flex tower out that's giving me carbon absorption every 30 minutes, and I can devise a net ecosystem exchange, or understanding a farmer and rancher's cow herd through simple phenotypic type of response variables. It might be weight, it might be frame, it might be body condition. Understanding how we can improve remote sensing to predict forage digestibility. We work some with a model called metabolizable digestible protein model from space to try to get to some of these better indicators at scale, right? And so I think it's finding the metrics that matter, Ash. I think it's the opportunity is having the answers at a high end level that costs quite a bit to really populate the system, but then refining it down to what truly matters, right? And if we can do that, I think that's the best way forward. I think it's going to definitely involve a remotely sensed ranch at some point. But it may be that we can identify certain key indicators at a ranch level that gives us a better estimate of forage digestibility and gross energy loss from the rumen as methane, or we can understand more about an animal's genetic makeup that also can give us an opportunity to see reductions or to see improvements, right? And then kind of bringing those more simplified metrics that are input driven from a farmer that might be more remotely sensed. I'm not real hardcore on the AI thing yet and the machine learning thing yet, to be honest, because I just think that from what I've learned, it just takes so many data points to populate these things to get them better. We'll get there probably sometime. It's not going to be really in the near future. But the point being is that finding these more simplified metrics that scale up into the answers we need, that gives us greater nuance. So it's not this carte blanche formula across North America to predict something, is the next iteration of this. And so, we see the opportunities for methane from the least efficient to the most efficient, as well as the acres we've talked about. I hope I'm not talking in circles, but that's kind of where I see it.
But your program, the research you're doing, you're basically trying to find out what the metrics that matter, and the only way to do that is to measure pretty much everything you can think of. So, do you want to just take a step back and go through all the different things you are monitoring on the farms and
Yeah.
ranches, just to give everyone
Yeah.
a feeling of how broad and what that pool of things is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, this is an Occam's razor. This is the whole toolbox. Yeah, we've got a project. The key collaborators are Noble Research Institute, Colorado State, Texas A&M, University of Wyoming. We've got others. I please forgive me, I didn't say your names. And basically have about 50 PIs and 70 staff in general, over, I believe, like 10 modules we've got, right? So we work with Colorado State and their soil carbon labs, Dr. Francesca Catrufo. And so we've identified 60 ranches in the U.S., Texas and Oklahoma, Colorado, Wyoming, and Michigan. And we have 3 intensive research sites: Noble Research, we have Michigan State University, Lake City, my farm, and then we've got University of Wyoming. Their McGuire Ranch up at about they're maybe 7,000-8,000 feet or more, maybe 10,000. I can't remember. High altitude, right? Yep. So you can see we've created a kind of a gradient of moisture, a gradient of growing conditions. And so we have a water module where we've got water sensors in the ground. And so what we did first of all then is we identified like a 10 to 15 acre site At our intensive areas, I've got replication of three, an n equals 3 replication where I've got these 10 to 15 acre blocks where I have all this instrumentation. And then I put what I call adaptive grazing and prescriptive grazing as treatments. We had the same thing in Oklahoma in a native warm season and in an improved warm season. And then we've got the same thing in Wyoming. So we've got adaptive and prescriptive replicated blocks with tremendous instrumentation. Then we take that 10 to 15 acre block approach, and then we did the same thing on 30 ranches, 10 in each of those sites. And then the last 30 ranches, we did very little. We took soil carbon. We do applied ecological monitoring. We don't put in water sensors, flux towers, all these, the whole kit and caboodle at it, because that's our site to see what kind of modeling, opportunities we have, right? We don't want to know as much to see how our modeling does. We're using different models, including the MEMS model Dr. Catrufo is working on. And so basically then we've spent a lot of money on creating data scaffolding, because you've got this disparate information coming from our towers, our water sensors, our remote sensing, and others, our applied ecological monitoring. We use the ecological outcome verification model that I helped create with Savory Institute. And how do you capture all that data? Okay, so we've got a data scaffolding we bring it into, and then Jeff Goodwin at Texas A&M leads our producer education, where we're getting, hey, what's your stock density here? What's your stocking rate here? What's your weaning weight here? So we get that applied information, and that information is the hardest to get. It is the hardest to get the producer information. And then we have socioeconomic modules that are looking into well-being and looking into money. And so that was kind of a quick one, and I probably missed some things, but we've got, we're in our 4th to 5th year, and we're actually going to try to extend this out further over time. And it's just beautiful, man. When you can look at 10 towers from ranch sites that are giving you real-time carbon uptake over years, and seeing net absorption versus net emissions, right? Like, the data becomes powerful. And then how does that carbon uptake compared to carbon sequestration? Well, we're in a 5-year window in Oklahoma and Michigan. We're going to try in Wyoming in 5. I don't know if we'll see anything, but I hope that paints the picture of the scale and the power of what we're doing. I'm not aware of anything this ambitious, really, and it's a fun thing to do, but it's really hard as hell to manage.
No, that's fascinating. And firstly, hats off to you for digging in so deep in terms of collecting all this data and putting together this amazing collaborative effort across so many different institutions and geographies. That's awesome to hear. Um, one thing, and it comes to mind, it comes back a bit to some of the things that I discussed with Alan Savory, and we all have our own sensing systems, our eyes, our ears, our noses, which, for, I guess, the best part of the last, million or 2 million years that humans have been on the planet has been our primary source of data. So how do we, and Alan's not a huge fan of technology. He's a big fan of reading things through visually, how you kind of read the land, I guess, rather than having lots of digital stuff. How do you see that, and how do you see the balance between, using our sensors as data collective devices compared to, digital technologies?
So Alan, like, if I could use a quote from him now, Alan always has said is that, humans only see what they believe. They don't believe what they see. And he's talking about, our biases, and that we only see what we already believe, right? And there's not a better judge of ecological function than Alan Savory. There's not a better ecologist on the land than Alan Savory. And I will support that to my grave. And visiting his ranch and working with them for a continuous period of time, right? And I think that um, there are I think that there are intuitive relationships that we have with land. Like you watch Alan, he's always walking barefoot. This guy's walking barefoot through the bush, right? And I always laugh. Can I just go on a side note?
Please
You know,
do.
you got all these, you've got all these like, you know, hugely wisdom driven, self proclaimed prima donnas on Facebook saying Alan Savory's full of it. And I mean, these dudes are sitting in ivory towers all over the world typing this shit. And then you've got Alan that's been walking barefoot in the bush since he was 5 years old. And who are you going to believe? Okay. And I've worked hard in my career to visit, holistically managed ranches. I've been to Alan's site in Zimbabwe, and there's nothing like, going and seeing that, because you will change your paradigms when you see the successes of managing holistically. And the point then is that we need to continually be flexible in our management. We need to have a grazing management plan. We need to understand how ecosystem processes flow, but we need to be flexible and we need to make changes when appropriate. And the only way to do that is to have that nurture, to have that bond with the land. That's how you make those decisions. You can't make them from a office in New York with remote sensing, right? You have to have a tie to it. And again, I think what happens then is that we can use technologies to scale up measurement, but it's awfully hard, I think, unless we have the right tools to make decisions at the land level. And so it is a combination. And so, but I do believe that understanding how these things function at a very granular level is hugely important. And so, but in my work with Alan's never really shied away from technology. He just wants to be very careful in how you use it. And if you read his book and if you listen to him, he'll typically call technology like the most overused tool, I think, maybe, or the most, everybody thinks the silver bullet again, Ash, is technology. I would argue it's management and understanding that piece, but not, but using technology when appropriate. And I love that opportunity where those segment.
I think that's a very important nexus, and I think walking through the bush, being an Australian, I spent more time than most walking bare feet around, and the bottom of your feet are a sensor system. You walk on a lush piece of grass, or the soil moisture, and there's a whole, or it's really, that is a sensor system in its own way. And also going back to Alan to a certain extent, and he had a military background at it, an early part of his career, and military commanders pretty much universally say that even the best battle plan never survives the first contact. So once things start getting dynamic, then you need to be thinking not what you pre-planned, but what is happening very much in the moment. And I think there's something that can be taken from that in terms of that nexus between that dynamic next management
Right.
approach that you've been talking about. So where do you see the opportunities there?
Well, I think the great Mike Tyson says everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the nose, right? And I think that's kind of similar to
Yeah,
to
very
what you're
much.
saying. And yeah, and I mean, I think that if we take what we're learning through climate science, and we're seeing these increased peaks and valleys of unpredictability, right? Like intense moisture, longer dry periods, um, more ups and downs with temperatures, etc. All of that leads to being more adaptive in planning and leads to being more adaptive in moving forward, right? And so I'm going to share some science from my colleague Bruno Basso, where he's done a lot of modeling work, right? And if you like, what are back to the metrics? What metrics truly matter to sustain us, right? What is going to sustain us moving forward? If we chase a carbon molecule, and esteem carbon is the one metric that sustains life, you farm potentially a different way than you might if you're thinking more about productive stability in a system. Okay, so I'm going to take two systems and separate them out. So number one, and this is Bruno, that he's the guy behind this, not me. But if you want to build carbon below ground, 80%, 70 to 80% of carbon inputs in a crop system, they come from above ground and not below ground, right? And often those carbon inputs are coming from crop residues. So if I have 300 bushel corn and I have, I don't know, 5 tons of residual biomass being put back into that field in a no-till system, then that's going to yield a very good carbon outcome based on modeling. But let's say hypothetically that I have a much more diverse crop rotation, so I'm adding different crops in that system. I actually lose carbon inputs to a certain degree because I'm not growing 300 bushel corn year after year after year. I'm adding different things in there. But so that diversity maybe covers and all these things adds to more stability in the system. It's more drought tolerant, it's more flood tolerant, but it may not just show greater carbon uptake in the soil than that system that's constantly pumping all this biomass back into the field. And then finally, what if you take animals and put them back in that system? Oh no, well, you've got methane going up. Oh, if the methane's going up, it's got a positive carbon footprint and it's going to effing ruin the world. Okay. And so, however, if you look at farmer income and you look at, again, the stability of that system to feed people, that's the best answer. So the point then is that understanding what the challenges are and how we address them make those decisions very very not straightforward, but they point you in the directions you need to go. Do we want a food system that has more productive resilience, it's more adaptive, that has the managers understanding what's going on, or do we just want to chase a carbon molecule so we can sell it to Google? Okay, and so based on that, I think there's a lot of variation in what we're seeing in terms of management. And so in my purview, that more resilient system that has more diversity, that has more opportunity, I think that should be our future, right? And so part of that is it'll be more resilient. It will respond to these changes quicker, but it takes management, it takes education, and I think education, like you listen to my friend, like Gabe Brown will say that over and over again, that education is the biggest bottleneck we have right now. And so, thankfully we've got a new young generation coming along, and I think it'll be really cool and killer, to see that.
The term that comes to mind with everything you've just said is embracing the complexity, because it is, you're thinking about that corn residue going into the soil, and you've got a single input going in for whatever that soil microbiome is trying to, live amongst, because they're living off a monoculture then as well. And suddenly you put, a dozen or 2 dozen species, and then that's going to impact the soil microbiome. It's going to impact the insects, etc., and invertebrates that are living there, which is going to impact the birds and other species that are coming around. So it's all about that complexity rather than embracing or pursuing the simplicity.
You're right, and we don't measure that, nor are farmers paid for it, and so it is the the Serengeti rules, man. If you read the book, right, it's the trophic cascades that sustain us. And you look at the biodiversity metrics and the huge diminishment of insects and birds and other populations, along with the loss of land. We're worried about our poor cows devastating earth, but asphalt's a hell of a lot bigger foe than a cow to our long-term resilience and sustainability, right? And so it's absolutely about those things. And you know what? Maybe those models begin to yield different outcomes when we have better data to populate them, but we don't. I mean, you think about it, like in opposite, right? The grassland systems, 60 to 80% of the carbon in that grassland system is coming from below ground, not above ground. It's exudates, it's microbiology, it's roots, it's microinvertebrates, whatever you just we talked about, right? And when you think about all those complexities that are there, it's awesome. In 2 years, by grazing with density in our system, measuring with our towers, for example, it could change. This is just very early preliminary stuff, but I can show you through my adaptive approach, and I'm not calling it holistic plant grazing because it's really not. It's a science project, but our ethos is behind that. Using that approach of thinking holistically. But I can show you through increasing my stock density and allowing for longer recovery periods as compared to a quote unquote prescriptive approach where I let animals graze a pasture down to 3 inches and then I yank them out. I wait 30 days, I throw them in, let them take it down to 3 inches, I yank them out, and do that 3 to 5 times based on a given grazing season. So if I compare that system to this adaptive system, I'm going to call it, we've picked up 4 tons of carbon uptake difference in 2 years with our towers, replicated 4 tons. The positive, we've got 2 to the positive and 2 to the negative, and that's carbon uptake. It isn't sequestration, right? We're not accounting for an above ground net primary productivity. So there could be grass residual that has some carbon. There could be some litter on top. We've got weight gain in an animal, but but the key is energy. Actually, it's absorbing energy. And I can show you that we've got a 4-ton difference in a few years just based on that, right? And you throw cattle in, they're going to graze the hell out of certain plants and they're going to overgraze the hell out of them. And you're going to get imbalances with biodiversity where that high stock density approach and longer recovery periods, we have a much more uniform defoliation that gives a longer recovery period time for certain plants to have more opportunities to germinate, whether it be a trefoil or a clover that can't take overgrazing as well, for example, right? And it's a beautiful creation that you can watch in that context. And I do think that, I hope that we can see these opportunities moving forward with that. I think if we could find the right metrics of biodiversity, everybody's trying to figure it out. But that's what sustains us, and that's what will sustain us in the future too.
On the adaptive versus prescriptive side of things, it
Yeah.
makes me think a bit about riding a horse. And if you move to the rhythm of the horse over different ground, rocky ground, hilly ground, flat ground, and you adapt to the horse's rhythm as it moves, you'll have a nice ride. If you expect the horse to adapt to your rhythm, you'll just end up with a sore bum.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like marriage.
I
Yeah.
don't think we'll get much dissent on that one.
No, but you're right, right? It's like you need to be. You're right, man. I grew up riding horses, and I prefer a gator now. But it is. It's very similar, right? And it's learning to adapt and going with something. It's working with nature, not against it. It's working with your companion and not against it, right? And I think that I think that's a huge and really appropriate analogy. And so in that context, let's think about how we ensure farmers through federal policies, right? Let's think about creating these opportunities and frameworks that improve and incentivize working with nature versus creating structures that are so linear that they often force farmers to make poor decisions because of federal guidelines. I think it's changing. I worked a lot with Senator Stabenow before she retired, and of course was the majority leader for the Ag Nutrition and Forestry Committee. Great person to work with, and she really tried, I think, to get more of that common sense into farm policy with her colleagues, and I think we need more of it. And what that looks like, I'm not sure, but hopefully we can make improvements.
Jason, so thank you so very much for everything so far. And before we go, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
I think that we're in an age right now where that this theme that you and I've chatted about is addressing complexity, right? We can't look at a human. We look at things so binary, and they're red or blue, or they're black and white. They're clean cut, and so if somebody agrees with one thing that RFK says and is "Make America Healthy Again," if you agree with one thing, well, you're now an anti zealot, you're a cult person, and you're all these things. And likewise, any of the political candidates, there are things you can agree, there's things you disagree, but we just tend to put people in two buckets, right? And those are creating this awful opposition with each other. And I think that unless we can begin to kind of nuance our thinking and nuance our evolution as a society, we're in for some rough times, man. And we're already kind of facing that, right? And so I read a lot of books about ego and shedding bias and trying to be present. And it's hard because we all have an ego, right? We all think we might know, but so I guess my passing thoughts are to give grace, to give mercy, to try to move forward in a way that is understanding of the complexity we have as human beings in our belief systems and thoughts, and not just take a single thing we disagree with and throw somebody out with the bathwater.
Jason, thank you so very, very much for joining me today.
Cool, man. Let's do some methane work.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks, mate.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Ash Cloud. Please subscribe to Ash Cloud if you've enjoyed this podcast, where I will continue to discuss food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental, political, and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them.